called away on account of the death of his father. I have the honor of introducing our speaker for the evening. He tells me he's a noodler. Well, I know what a noodler is. Some of us probably don't know what a noodler is. Some do, some don't. You're going to have to explain that.
They're crazy.
Did you say
They're crazy.
He's richly qualified to speak on the subject chosen, which is the Civil War in the folklore of the Ozarks. You have observed from the buck and ball that he is a member of the faculty at Southwest Missouri State University and currently a member of the Ozark Studies team. It is a pleasure to introduce Dr. Donald B. Holliday. Mr. Holliday.
I'm impressed with this club, this organization. An organization with a bottle of Wild Turkey sitting back there on the shelf. I'm not a historian. I'm a folklorist. Folklorists deal with history and a little bit of everything else. Dr. Lightfoot called me. We just plugged right at the bottom of that and makes the whole thing work. I don't need it.
The paper doesn't need to be screwed.
I don't think I need this at all. If it goes off and you can't hear me, just yell, and I'll make you hear me. I used to call cows 3 ridges away without straining too much. I can make you hear me. Dr. Lightfoot called me about a month ago, 6 weeks ago maybe, talking about the Civil War in the folklore of the Ozarks. I said I'd do it. I didn't know a thing about it. I still don't. I'm going to talk about it anyway. By the way, how long am I supposed to talk? You get through. Well, you're not. Okay. Guys don't have any engagements before midnight?
Yeah, we've got one 10 o'clock.
There's been little or no research into the Civil War in Ozarks history. There has been little or no collecting deliberately done in the Civil War in Ozark folklore. There is a great deal of material about the Civil War in the Ozarks, but it covers a broad spectrum of materials. Approaching this subject, I made a number of limitations upon the subject, which I thought were necessary in order to simply to draw the subject together enough where I could kind of get my teeth into it, or my fingernails into it, one or the other. One of the limitations I made was upon a broad body of material commonly regarded as reminiscence. Something I suspect many of you are familiar with. There's a fairly large collection in the Greene County Library of reminiscence material. Various archives contain a great deal of reminiscence material which was collected by the writers' projects during the 1930s, and material which different families have put together. For instance, Aunt Margaret Gilmore, out by Ash Grove, Dean Gilmore at SMS, his aunt. Has a little memoir of her life as a small girl, as a young girl, during the Civil War in the Ozarks. I accepted that material because it's terribly difficult to distinguish between the folklore and the history. Almost all reminiscence material has some folklore in it, but attempting to distinguish is a long and arduous task, which a month to 6 weeks didn't give me. Any exhaustive study on the subject of Civil War in Ozarks folklore should take into consideration all of this reminiscence material and attempt to distinguish between what is folklore and what is simply oral history. That's simply to say that out of the personal narratives, out of personal history, that material which is folklore, or the material which has entered into a kind of a bloodstream of the Ozarks, which is told and retold broadly by people throughout the Ozarks. That's what folklore is. The reminiscence, most of it is personal history. Another limitation I made on the subject was quasi-history or quasi-cultural study. There is a broad body of this material, from Kephart's Our Southern Highlanders to Otto Ernest Rayburn's Ozark Country. Both of these and all the material between are works which are valuable in their own right in certain ways, but the methodologies of those works are unclear or non-existent, and it's almost impossible there to distinguish between what is folklore and what is merely the observation of Mr. Kephart or Mr. Rayburn. Another limitation that I made, the third and last, due to the wide extent of the Ozarks geographically, but the limited extent of the research or collecting of folk materials by qualified people within the Ozarks, I've been forced to limit really to the western Ozarks. That area covered by primarily by Vance Randolph and by others. The Ozarks, as our Ozark Studies team at SMS will point out to you, is a big place. It's been called a lot of things. One of my favorite descriptions is Ozarks is the backyard of 3 or 4 or 5 states. It's a big backyard in Arkansas. It's a big backyard in Missouri. There's a little corner, it's a very small corner in Kansas, and a sizable area in Oklahoma. And if one wishes to include it, there's geological reason to call part of the southern tip of Illinois the Ozarks, and many folklorists treat that area as a part of the Ozarks, geologically, geographically. Once I made those 3 exceptions, what remains is a limited body of tales and jests and some folk history, which seems to me to be, at first, only peripheral to the real matter of the Civil War. And what I suspect most of you here are concerned with, battles and the outcomes of battles. Folklore offers very little comment on that material. Nowhere, for instance, have I found stories, jests, or ballads which lay blame upon or claim glory for either the North or the South. In American Negro folklore, I found only incidental references to the Civil War or to slavery, most of them time references before the War for Freedom, back in slavery times, or while Master was gone away to fight in the Civil War. Only incidental references in American Negro folklore. And in the Ozarks, at least, there has been no growth of a body of legend about the exploits of any particular war hero. There have been near misses, to be sure, such as the reminiscences about what happened to General Lyon's sword. But that possibility was squelched when it was revealed without question that General Lyon just didn't wear a sword. But in the folklore of the Ozarks, there seems to be no heroes. Very, very little in the way of heroics. But on reflecting, starting out with the idea that there's a very, very limited body of material only peripherally related to the Civil War. Upon reflection, I asked myself, why should I be surprised that there is no great body of Civil War folklore in the Ozarks? After all, what was the Civil War to the people of the Ozarks living here before 1860? Then I reflected, Wilson Creek was one of the major engagements of organized forces in the Ozarks, and the sad result of that battle may well be symbolic of the Civil War in the Ozarks. Where that battle, there were no real winners. There were only the dead, and the land which belonged to neither the Union nor the Confederacy. There was a land left to the living who had to bury the dead. There was a land left to the survivors who had yet to survive against the bushwhackers and, not the least of adversaries, against the land and against time. Nor did the survivors have to adjust to winning or losing, for geographically and ideologically, the mass of early settlers of the Ozarks were neither northern nor southern, but they did have to adjust to the winners and the losers, both of whom were a part of the people of the Ozarks. In their folklore, the people of the Ozarks have buried the dead, and they did for a long time. They tell stories of children playing with the bones of the dead soldiers upon the battlefields, especially at Key Ridge. They have told stories of soldiers' graves exploding, scattering bones everywhere, perhaps the result of coffinless bodies covered with a mere sheeting of soil. They remember old Austin, Arkansas, where for lack of money, near 500 bodies lay for several months unburied. But the burying of the dead was not the only horror, nor was it necessarily the greatest. The bushwhackers, lawless men attached to any army or to no army, have left their imprint upon the folklore of the Ozarks. Stone County has a haunted pond into which 100 bodies of bushwhackers were thrown, and they were killed by the Home Guard. It is believed by some still in Stone County and in the past by many more that it's worth your life to go near that pond at night. At Osceola, Missouri, a Confederate soldier and his sweetheart, legend has it, were murdered by bushwhackers. The Red Bluff legend of Osceola has it that you can see their shapes etched into the red bluff, and sometimes at night you can hear the rifle shots which killed them. Near Ava, Missouri, there's the legend of the headless cobbler of Smollett's Cave, an old shoemaker who was beheaded by bushwhackers. Near Forsyth, Missouri, is a Reverend Fisher whose wife rolled him up into a carpet and carried him out to safety when she saw the bushwhackers coming. These are but a few of the bushwhacker stories of the Ozarks. I say this is peripheral to the real matter of the Ozarks, which are real matters of the Civil War. But then again, I wonder, perhaps this is merely what war is about, whether it be among organized troops, or disorganized, or simply unorganized troops. Growing out of the bushwhacker Jayhawk stories, in which case bushwhacker means a little different than what it does as I've been using it. I've been using bushwhacker merely as a band of outlaws roaming around, doing as they please. In the bushwhacker Jayhawk, Missouri, Kansas border stories, related, but again not identical to other bushwhackers in the Ozarks, come the stories of the James, the Youngers, the Daltons. Practically a cyclical body of legend. Some of the same stories are attributed to both the James and to the Youngers, and people have avowed that the stories are true for both of those groups of brothers. These stories are decidedly Confederate in sympathy, but they tell a good deal more of what happened after the war than what happened during the war. Vance Randolph has collected within the Ozarks quite a number of stories of the Robin Hoodish exploits of the James boys. Probably the most familiar of these is the story of the widow woman and the robbers. The widow is visited by two young men in the evening, and she fixes them a good meal and offers them a bed, and she tells them that the next day the Yankee moneylender is coming to foreclose on her farm. She's got only $50. There's a $400 mortgage against the place. They lend her $350. The Yankee moneylender comes the next day and is a little surprised that the lady has $400, but he signs the receipt paid in full. And later that evening, the two young men come back, and the widow begins to tell them how she'll try to repay them the $350, and they say, "Don't worry about that, ma'am. We got our money back already. And here's the $50. We never take money from war widows, from Confederate widows." That story has been attributed to both the James boys and the Younger boys. One of the stories places it near Willow Springs, Missouri. Of course, the James boys have occupied every cave in the Ozarks, and they have ridden up and down every trail. The legend of the James boys is much larger than the Ozarks. There are stories about the James boys being in Eureka Springs and Willow Springs and Minnesota and Nebraska and Kentucky all at the same time, which is a little far-fetched. But there are a couple of other stories about the James boys that are relatively common, or at least the type is relatively common. There's a story of a stagecoach holed up near Hot Springs, Arkansas, in which a Confederate soldier says, "Hey, I'm a Confederate," and they give him his wallet and his watch back. We never take things from Confederates. There's also a story of this one set in Eureka Springs, Arkansas, where they hold up a stagecoach and a preacher says, "Hey, I'm a preacher," and they give him his wallet back. They met that evening at the hotel in Eureka Springs, and the James boys began to wonder, now, is this guy really a preacher? Sitting at the table with Frank James' gun in his ribs, the minister prayed very, very fervently, and they decided he must be a preacher after all. If there is a body of Ozark folklore dealing with the horrors of war and the bitterness which resulted after the war, that body of folklore is overshadowed in bulk and in importance by the folklore of adjustment. Common people, the people meant in the folk part of folklore, those people may fight, but it doesn't take them long after the fighting stops simply to turn to living, to turn to survival, if you will. It is then that past events themselves begin to turn into a kind of hazy history. Time itself dims the realities of war in favor of the present. Time, in some of the folklores, in some of the folk tales, dims as it does in the tale of the woman and the robber, where the tale teller says, as he begins to tell the story, maybe it was in the war between the states. He isn't sure. He doesn't know. It's an easy time to attribute it to, but he no longer attributes it to that time in particular. I'll give you the story of the woman and the robber shortly. At the time when people turn from the bitter memories of war to the expedients of the present, those things of human nature which are with people every day, human foibles, everyday activities, these become once again the subject of the stories told. At that point in American history, or in the history of the Ozarks, the Civil War furnished a grand setting and little more for a fairly broad body of folk tales, some of which came out of the Civil War, but which were not simply about the Civil War. Many of the stories that I'll mention briefly as I run through this have also been collected and attributed to soldiers of the First World War. A few of them to World War II yet, but a few of them there. I've attempted to divide the body of stories that I found into a few fairly simple categories. I have not had time to fully digest all of these stories and to come to what I would think might be a final conclusion about them. So these categories may be relatively tentative. Quite a number of stories about soldiers who are braggarts and what happens to them. What happens to soldiers who brag too much, whether they be Confederate or Union. There's a story of Colonel Culpeper. Now, it doesn't take much imagination to determine which side he was on. Colonel Culpeper, he was a recruiter down in Arkansas. About the time the war started, he said, "We can whoop them Yankees with pop guns." Well, the war was over. Colonel Culpeper came back home, and people wondered. "I thought you was going to whoop them Yankees with pop guns." And he said, "The trouble is, them Yankees won't fight with pop guns." This is one example. I'll give you a number of others. What I called already a folklore of adjustment, putting those bad memories back into some kind of balance so you can live with those memories. One can carry bad memories for a long time, and if he carries them too much, they'll drive him crazy. They'll make a mean man out of him. But if you go on living the way most people go on living, you have to adjust to those things. I think in the folklore of the Ozarks, there is evidence that Ozark people in Arkansas or Missouri, as important as that line is in Ozark history, people in the Ozarks in Arkansas and Missouri have adjusted a great deal. Also, soldiers, braggart soldiers, who are merely soldiers by incident in these stories. More than anything else, they're just human beings who do silly things, as human beings do everywhere. The soldier who came back and handed his ma the black book and said, "Ma, take this book. I've carried it through Yankee shot and shell. I've read it through from Genesis to Revelations 3 times." She said, "So that's what happened to my songbook." This is a story of the Home Guard. A number of stories of the Home Guard. This one in particular is about Captain Boaz, who the little strutting man who is unable or afraid to go to war, but who stays home and organizes the home troops. A wounded fellow by the name of Tom Hopper come home and saw all the drilling. Every day, Captain Boaz drilled his troops in front of the post office. Tom Hopper started telling stories about them Yankees that invented a gun that didn't make no noise. And one day the troops was drilling there in front of the post office, and suddenly something popped against the building beside him, and went to look. There was a great old big lead slug laying out on the sidewalk, but nobody had heard the noise of the gun. This happened 2 or 3 times. And, the young soldier, Tom Hopper, finally died of his wounds, not from the silent rifle of the Yankees. Captain Boaz went to Tom Hopper's home and found a slingshot there and a handful of Yankee grape shot or Confederate grape shot. It didn't make much difference, or mini balls or whatever that young Tom Hopper had been slinging at the Home Guard in his slingshot. There are a number of stories about GAR reunions, the glorious Army of the Republic, and no army as it is as glorious as it is at reunions. Ever been to a military reunion of any kind? They're glorious. The story of Colonel Fordyce, one of the better members of the town, Southerner, of course, who, after the GAR boys had been tearing up the town for 3 or 4 days, and they had finally gone home, there was one old GAR fellow left there on the sidewalk. One leg is gone, one arm is gone, holding with his hat in front of him, and Colonel Fordyce walked along and threw a $5 bill in his hat. This old GAR veteran said, "Hold it a minute." Said, "All these GAR boys have been putting nickels and dimes in here. What makes you, an ex-Confederate, put a $5 bill in there?" And Colonel Fordyce said, "Well, you're the only Yankee I've ever seen that was trimmed right proper to suit me." There's a story of the great Badger fight, in which the GAR boys in the town are trying to get up enough money to build a hall. Of course, most of the better people in the town are Confederates. And nobody gave them any money, so then they got up a big Badger fight and advertised it and sold tickets to Lowry's stable, $2 a piece, and everybody come. And they had a great old big bulldog that was supposed to fight this big Badger. They sold a lot of tickets. Everybody was waiting there, and they got the bulldog out, and they pulled the door open on that cage that the big Badger was in, and nothing come out. They started trying to get somebody to pull him out, but them Badgers is mean, and nobody would do it until finally Colonel Ledbetter walked down there and said, "I'll pull him out of there," and he grabbed the chain and started yanking on it and yanking on it. Finally yanked a great old big China piss pot out. That's all that was in there. That was the great Badger fight. The colonel was a little red in the face after that, and he just stomped out of there, but he seemed to turn up the butt of the joke. This particular story is pretty widespread in the Ozarks. I found a half a dozen different varieties of it. It happened not only in Springfield, but in a number of other towns in the area. There are a large number of these GAR stories. One more. At one of those GAR reunions, the GAR colonel is making his speech, and he says, in the last war we was enemies, but in the next war we'll all be fighting under the flag of the United States. We'll all be comrades. And there was a Confederate sitting on the sides listening, and he said, no, we won't neither. You know better than that. Well, why not? We're all one nation again. Well, it'll just be us old Confederates fighting, because all you Yankees are drawing pensions for being disabled. There are a number of stories which come close at times to, I think, revealing the universal story of the soldier in battle. The soldier on the battlefield, whether he be Civil War, World War I, World War II, Korea, or whatever. Soldiers wishing they were somewhere else than right where they are. There's very little glorious and very little heroic on most battlefields during battle. One story about a young fellow, a young Confederate conscript, 15 years old, in the middle of a battle, frightened, he began to cry. The old sergeant says, ain't you ashamed of yourself, blubbering like a baby? And this young fellow says, I wish I was a baby, and a gal baby at that. Here's a story of a captured Confederate. Broke out of a Yankee prison camp and was trying to make it back to the South, and went for a week or a week and a half without any food, without any tobacco, just out in the weather, no shelter. Finally, one evening he was sitting on the side of a creek with his feet hanging in the water, trying to cool him off, and a Yankee captured him again. The Yankee said, don't you move, I've got you. The Confederate said, boy, you really got a lot, didn't you? That seems to reflect about as near as I can tell in folklore the reality of battlefields. There are also, of course, stories about garrison life. Two Yankee companies camped about a mile apart, always trying to outdo each other because that's about all they had to do. Them non-cons kept them fellers out there shining shoes and shining brass and brushing uniforms and everything else, just endless. You could hear them hollering all day long every day at them privates, corporals, and so. And they's trying to get the best of each other in case, to be the most military in case the colonel should come down, and you never could tell when that old bastard would show up. Well, one day there's a raggedy little man walked into camp, and the captain was sitting there eating his dinner, and he had his sword hanging up there on the camp pole, on the tent pole above his head, and this raggedy little old man come in. He said he was a preacher. He said he'd like to talk to the men about their souls. Well, the captain was about to run him out of camp, reaching for his sword, and the little raggedy man said, over in the other camp over there, I said, I talked to them, and I baptized 7 young soldiers. Captain hollered, Sergeant, come here. Sergeant come, yes, sir. I want you to detail 14 men to be baptized right now. Sergeant started walking off, kind of looking at him sideways, didn't know what was going on. Captain muttered, we'll beat that other company, even when it comes to religion, even if we have to baptize every goddamn man. There are stories also of men who are almost heroes, but they're stories about the men after the war. stories of Little Weed Marshall, a little short man who had rode with General Joe Shelby. Little Weed Marshall run a hotel, and the drummers, they was all Democrats really, but they pretended they was Republicans and was always raising Cain about the Democrats when they come to Little Weed Marshall's hotel, and talking about the Confederacy and everything else. And one time they got this great old big man to walk in there, and they put a GAR button on him and walked him in the hotel there, and he was sitting around talking about how sorry the Confederate Army was, and said he run into General Joe Shelby's troops one time, but he never got a chance to kill any of them because they run off too fast. So Little Weed Marshall was kind of saying nothing. Eyes getting narrower. And finally, just went too far talking about General Joe Shelby. When he started talking about once he run into one of General Joe Shelby's men, a little bitty feller, and that was too much. Little Weed Marshall yanked out his cannon and threw a couple of shots into the floor and the ceiling, and all the drummers run off, along with the big GAR man. For a little while, the GAR man come back in and told him that they put him up to it. But the drummers, they come in kind of sheepish a little one time. They never did talk about being Republicans anymore. Never did talk about the Confederacy anymore. They got to be kind of quiet in that town after that. The last general category, talk about the bushwhacker horror stories. There are quite a number of them that have been turned into humorous stories. There's a story of Brains for a Tanner. This one I want to read to you in its entirety as it's collected by Vance Randolph. One time there was an old fellow named Johnny Hutchinson walking home with a little sack of meal, when here come 7 Yankees a-riding south. They took the old man's meal and then they searched him, but he didn't have no money. Old man Hutchinson was a terrible stupid fellow, but kind of loud-mouthed because he used to be a school teacher. Probably he cussed them out or something. Anyhow, them Yankees killed him. Next morning, the women folks found him laying there in the road with 3 bullets in his chest. One of them Yankees was shot down in Arkansas about a week after that, and young Jim Hutchinson rode down there to see him. The fellow knowed he was a-dying, and he told Jim the names of the other Yanks that was there the day Johnny Hutchinson got killed. Jim checked up on them 6 names, and he found out that the fellow had told the truth, because every one of them was seen in the neighborhood the same day. They was wearing federal boots and breeches, but not one of them was regular enlisted in the Yank Army. They was just a bunch of bushwhackers roaming around to steal whatever they could find. Jim didn't do much talking, but it wasn't long till one of them fellows was found dead, laying in the road just about where old Johnny Hutchinson was killed. There wasn't no blood on the ground, so it looked like he had been shot somewhere else, and the corpse hauled down there in a wagon. A few weeks later, another dead Yank showed up in the same place with his throat cut from ear to ear. 2 down and 4 to go, says young Jim Hutchinson. Them 4 fellas laid low for a while, but then one of them got to fighting with some Cherokee people over at Southwest City, and a woman smashed in his head with one of those iron boot jacks they was using for a doorstop. The 3 that was left stuck mighty close together after that because they knowed young Jim Hutchinson was on their trail. One day they was standing in the street when Jim come a-riding into town. They killed his horse at the first fire, but Jim was a-shooting before he hit the ground. The crowd scattered like leaves in the wind, but 2 of them Yanks laid there dead, and the other one was a-dying. Jim was hit twice, but they was both flesh wounds. A deputy marshal got shot in the foot, and several citizens were scared out of a year's growth, but otherwise there wasn't no harm done. A fool woman run out in the street, and she says, "My goodness, why did you shoot all those men?" She was from up north somewheres, and didn't know any better than to ask questions like that. Jim seen she didn't mean no harm. I'm tanning a groundhog hide, man, says he, and it takes 3 or 4 Yankees to furnish the material. The woman just stood there with her mouth open because she couldn't make out what he was talking about. She told the doctor that poor Mr. Hutchinson must be hurt pretty bad because he acted kind of delirious. The home folks understood what Jim meant, and they was laughing about it all over town. We all tanned our leather Choctaw style in them days. You just scrape the fat off and rub a spoonful of fresh brains into the flesh side of the skin. That's a particular after the war story. It's a bushwhacker horror story that has been turned into a humorous story. This is the nature of folklore. It continues to grow and to be revised. Of course, many versions and variants go off. You tell a story one place and everybody in the country tells it, but they don't remember it exactly and so on. But so they grow geographically, but they also grow in content. In substance, folk tales grow, and there is evidence of one. The story that I mentioned first, The Woman and the Robber, is a story of a woman who took all of her gold and her greenbacks and was heading up north during the Civil War. At least the teller thought it might have been during the Civil War. And she come to a certain place and the feller jumped out of the brush. She was riding right along kind of the top of a cliff and come along there, and the fellow jumped out of the brush and tried to rob her. And she said, "Well, mister, I'm a proper lady. My money's in the petticoat. Just turn you back a minute and let me get it." And he turned, and before he knew what was happening, she had whipped a pistola out of her petticoat and had shot him dead. Well, she just took her foot and rolled him over the side of the bluff. Went on up to where she was going, and after the war, her and her family headed back south again, and they got to that place where she had killed that fella, and she told him about it. And they all went down there to the foot of the bluff to look for him, and there they found a whole stack of corpses down there that this fella had been robbing people and killing them and throwing them off of the bluff. These stories express, I think, the feelings of a lot of people for the Civil War. Most of you are very literate people, or maybe all of you are, I don't know. All of you may be PhDs, but you're all literate. You all read. You all have an interest in history. An interest which you pursue through printed sources, through the media of any type. But what if you don't read? Or not that you can't read, but what if you do not read much? How long do you remember? How much do you remember? In my family, until I was about 32 or 3 years old, I thought my great-granddaddy was a Confederate. Somewhere it seems like I had heard people talk about him being a Confederate. I started nosing around and discovered a great old big picture of him in a Yankee uniform. Picture this big. And nosing a little farther, I found discharge papers from the 11th Illinois Volunteers Artillery. And that ain't Confederate. And a little further nosing, I discovered he drew a pension, like all those other Yankees, I guess. So, the people who live day by day, the people whose primary concerns are the soil and the weather and tomorrow, but not necessarily day after tomorrow. What's Civil War history to them? And how much of it do they know? In the folklore, I think you have. At least part of the record, as far as I can tell now, as far as I've gone, and the research that I've done, I think you have a record of the Civil War in the folklore, the record of the common people of the
I've always been a bit amused with folklore and history, and I have a hell of a lot of distress sometimes trying to separate fact from fiction. Dr. Mayhew once said, if it's a truth, it's history. If it isn't, it's folklore. How do you respond to Dr. Mayhew's description? I think he does that just to irritate his wife.
I studied a good deal of history. Probably 15 hours or so of graduate history. 9 hours of it in Civil War history. I always wondered just how true history is. I do know we have to rewrite it every 20 years. Considerably. It has been a very, very short time since the only president we ever had in Missouri was rather commonly regarded throughout the United States as, I think the common name for him was Hairy Ass, wasn't it? What is it now? Regarded now as one of the greatest presidents in the United States by historians. So, what's truth? Well, truth is what we want to make it. Folk tales. Have you ever heard a good folk tale? A good tale. Have you ever heard it told that the teller didn't tell it just like it happened yesterday? Yeah. Right next door? Yeah. I think in a way it is true there. So what I'm doing is kind of going around your question without answering it, and I'm answering it too, I think. Folklore is about unreal events, but at the heart it's about people.
It has the ingredients of truth and history, yet it can't maybe be identified.
I was interested in reference to GAR as a Glorious Army Republic. Now, I don't know whether you intended that as part of the story that they call it the Glorious Army, but it's the Grand Army of the Republic, of course. I'm sure that you know that.
Glorious is, well, grand's okay, but glorious is better. Other questions or comments? I'm happy to hear your response in any way. If you want to dispute me, fine. Because this, as I said, I really haven't had time to investigate this as much as I'd like. My mind works kind of like a dream, I guess. It takes time for my mule to turn things out to where I'm satisfied with them.
Puts me in mind of witnesses to some incident, something that's maybe they're brought up in court, and they take the oath, tell the truth, give their version of it. Here comes the next witness. He was right there and he saw it. He's got an entirely different version of it. So that's one way they get colored up.
Oh yeah, this is true. There's a good deal of literature on just that point. Herman Melville has a long short story, really a short novel, I guess, Benito Sereno, which is a story about perception. How different people see things, and it ends with the court trial. How courts see things. So, people see things in different ways. Sometimes sometimes because they want to see different things. This is not necessary. This does not mean that they want that they deliberately bend details, but if you want to see things, sometimes you do. Mushroom season is here, just about over with this dry weather. I can see mushrooms just driving down the road, literally. I go on the brakes and jump out and see them, because after I hunt those things enough, I literally dream about morel mushrooms. I see those things, flashing in the darkness. I see morel mushrooms, and I can drive down the road and my eye will pick up morel mushrooms that are just, almost unnoticeable detail that's out there somewhere. So I can see them. I find a number of mushrooms that way, not driving down Interstate 44, mind you, but driving down this old Springfield Harrison Trail between Hollister and Omaha, Arkansas. I can drive along there 30 miles an hour and see mushrooms.
I want to ask you a question now. On these tales told after the war, the United Daughters of the Confederacy erected a monument in each of the Confederate states in honor of the Confederate women of their particular state. And some of those states published a book, Confederate Women. I have the one in Missouri and in Arkansas. I wonder if they all did, if each of those Confederate states did publish it. It's reminiscent accounts of their experience in the war.
I don't know whether all Confederate states did or not. I have seen Arkansas's, and I think it's a valuable work. I think any kind of reminiscence, any collection of eyewitness accounts of things, I think it's valuable, extremely valuable. I don't know whether other states did or not. Arkansas is a fantastic record of what women did to support the war. Some of you, all of you, not all of you certainly, remember the effort to support World War II. What went on here among men and women, everything. Everybody had a junk pile, you save those, that scrap iron. And it was worth money then. But not only that, but you have butter at home and gasoline and so on, so you can send it to the war.
One interesting one, maybe I forget whether it's Confederate women, Missouri, Arkansas, or where, but I got a sort of a bang out of was Beast Butler when he was at New Orleans. His vicious or his strict regulations and so on brought on they were unanimously hated Yankees anyway. And one of the priests in the church, and they were nearly all Catholics down there, and he had been known to have uttered a statement that he would absolutely refuse to perform the burial services for any damn Yankees. And Butler heard of that. He was arrested and brought before the general, and the charges was read, and then he was asked if he had uttered that statement. He said, "General," he said, "you have been misinformed." He said, "May I assure you it would be a pleasure to me to perform the funeral services for you and all your men."
We have this club has a member who's quite a folklorist, Gordon McCann here.
Oh, no.
He has interviewed quite a number of ancient people, including my dad, recorded it, and later on typed it up. I think that's a commendable work.
In your collections, have you collected anything about the Civil War?
Yeah, quite a bit. Bits and pieces. I'm just a collector. I'm not a folklorist.
Vance Randolph made the distinction. He said, "I'm not a folklorist." Folklorist is somebody who studies folklore, but Vance Randolph is regarded by folklorists in the United States as one of the major folklorists in the United States, simply because they collected. One of the things that a folklorist does is collect. That's the first thing he does.
The only thing I was wondering about when you mentioned the ballads and the singing and all that, and of course you said you were dealing with western Missouri, but of course Sam Hildebrand, there's a lot about him over in the counties east of us here.
And there are a number of people, quite a number of people that you hear about in ballads, especially in ballads. The ballads tell much of the same thing that folk tales do, but they're generally a good deal more sentimental. Most of them fall in the category with those of the James boys or the younger boys. There are even tales of Gib Morgan, who was an oil man. He's almost a folk hero of the oil industry from Pennsylvania to Morocco to Kuwait. That somehow Morgan got tied in with the Civil War.
Of course, Jesse James crossed the White River 37,000 times because everybody's great-grandfather held his horse. You know.
Oh, yeah. He held his horse, and in one tale that went across in this, Jefferson Davis was elected the governor of Arkansas. And in American Negro folklore, Abraham Lincoln evidently was just all over the South because many ex-slaves told stories of talking to President Lincoln and shaking hands with him and so on. This is one of the things that happens in folklore. Great men somehow get around. People want to meet them, talk to them. It's a matter of stature for one thing. To say that I did so and so with someone. I used to sing with Jimmy Driftwood. Well, one time at Jimmy Driftwood's house we sung together, but that's
search for identity.
Sure, that's part of that.
Have you seen the plaque up there by Otterville? That's in the song last Saturday night, "The Moon was Shining Bright," when you robbed the Otterville train on 50 Highway right east of Otterville. There's a cutoff, and you pull out there and you look down where the train was supposed to be robbed. Now they built a new bypass around it, and all the tourists miss it.
Yeah. Well, they'll move to Marker. Any other questions? Comments?
I'd like to ask you, in your research, have you ever dug up any evidence that the Jameses were up there on that raid on the Northfield Bank in Minnesota? Some say they did, but they were there, some say they weren't. I know they had the younger boys there, and they caught them and killed one or two of their men. But James, if they were there, they sure got away.
This is a question that's been beaten around a good deal. I think it was the James gang that robbed that bank in Minnesota, and if the James boys weren't there, it's a real miracle that they're.
The youngers are all there. They caught all of them.
Yes.
Well, they have a big picture of the wall. The James boys like to break there.
Yeah. Very broad area that the James boys covered.
Fast horses know that.
Yeah, this was one of that bank in Kentucky was one in particular where the James boys were supposed to have robbed a bank. I believe it was in Arkansas, and there were posses out hunting for them and everything else, and it was later proved that, well, the James boys didn't do that because they were over there at that bank in Kentucky doing that job at the same time. So either they had mighty fast horses, or they just didn't do them both.
I have a speculative question for you. I'm not sure if you want to put it on the spot, or give you a difficult question if you're not prepared.
Well, if it's one I can't answer, I just won't answer it. But I
Given
don't
the growth of mass communications today with radio and TV, etc., as opposed to the original way folklore has been passed down mouth to mouth. Two-part question. A, is folklore being invented today? Is it being, passed on continually? And B, would you speculate about what the 21st century, what kind of folklore will there be about the 20th century?
The folklore of the people, whoever they are, whatever they are. Got any attorneys here? Any folklore of the courts right now?
I'd just like to ask a question.
Well, okay, just, can I take just a second? There's a folklore of courtrooms. There's a folklore of there's an academic folklore. There's a folklore of truck drivers, cat skinners, folklore of occupations, especially these days. In large cities, there's a very, very active folklore among blacks in America in large cities. In Philadelphia, an excellent book by Roger Abrahams titled Deep Down in the Jungle, subtitle Negro Narrative in the Streets of Philadelphia. That shows that folklore, a very, very rich body of folklore, alive and well today. It's a direct descendant of Southern folklore that some of you are slightly familiar with in terms of Uncle Remus. You ever heard of a signifying monkey? Well, get that Abraham's book and familiarize yourself with the signifying monkey. Fantastic creature. Let me get...
Yes, I have the book that you speak of in my library. And I feel very close to the discussion that you made there. In the Civil War, my father and his brother were all in the Civil War. They moved to Missouri shortly after. And I grew up in a little place down there in Missouri where they fought battles during the Civil War. They burned the town down in 62 and burned it down again in 64. One side burned in 62, the other side burned in 64. There's a little place called Hartsville. I have in my library what they call the Encyclopedia of Missouri. And it tells a lot about what you were talking about. And I know that the stories that you tell are almost true history. Because my parents have told me almost the same thing. And I've been so much impressed because you say that. I've been inclined to intrude again when I hear that you're going to have this sort of thing.
Fine.
You read my court stories. I used to practice on Judge Atlas Court in Dallas. He was a real character. He sat on the bench early. He was 90 years old. We had a hearing up at Wichita Falls sometime before that. The old man had a habit, if he laid his head back like that, he'd pass out. So he got on the elevator there at noon, started to go to lunch, and he kind of laid his head back a little like that, and passed out, and fell, and his hands fell out over the floor of that elevator, and just went up the next, he was going back from lunch, and as he went up, he scraped all the backs off his hands and put a terrible gash in his forehead. They rushed the old man to the hospital, and he wouldn't stay. He came back and held court that afternoon. Had a nurse sitting on the bench with him. That's the kind of old judge I had there.
That's the kind of story that can grow and grow and grow too, and become.
I know this was true because I saw it.
A good deal of folklore begins in this kind of incident with a character like that, and then it spreads. And because human.
He was a marvel.
Yeah.
You think he was asleep, but he never missed it. He was doing all that court.
Yeah. There's a fair body of Ozark judicial folklore, I guess. One story of it came out of Taney County. A guy had cut a bee tree on his own property he had a deed for that property, and there was a bee tree there, and he cut it. But somebody else was the one that had found it and had put an X on it with his old pocket knife, and the guy who had found it, according to the old unwritten law of the hills, whoever finds it owns it. And there's, that open range thing was pretty open. And the guy who had found that hauled this other dude into court. The justice of the peace listened to the thing, to the trial, and well, it seemed clear enough to him that bee tree belonged to the guy that found it. The other guy had cut it. He admitted it. And old J.P. considered a while and said, guilty or not, you'll plow for 2 days for Dewey Turner. Guilty or not. It's one of those situations, you don't know quite which way to go on, but the way I interpret the law here, you're fined 2 days plowing. That's kind of a rich body of that kind of folklore. Another hand here somewhere.
Well, I was just going to bring out the fact that the Indians were probably the greatest ones for handing down from father to son on down. The only way they had to record their history.
One of many. Indians did, of course, but this is something that almost all cultures have done. Some cultures are more literate than others, but what you're talking about is, Aborigines or primitive people who lack a writing system, or at least a formalized writing system, do have means of passing their knowledge, their valuable knowledge on. American Indians or groups in the Philippines or in Africa or wherever. Or, up until 1900 or so, some of the most backward, barbaric people in the world were, they lived in Scotland and Ireland. I'm Scotch-Irish, so I feel like I can say that without any problem, but literally, as progress goes, the Scotch and Irish have not been very progressive, and because of that, there's especially among the Irish, a rich body of folklore. Some of it, there are storytellers there who can sit all day long and tell the same story. There are stories that are, that long, oral tales that are that long, and there are people who still tell them.
On the question of this folklore still being created, been doing some work for the National Forest Service, cultural resources. The biggest folklore area now is that of local people commenting on the back to the country movement, on city people from St. Louis or Springfield coming to float the 11-Point River, or communes developing, describing all the crazy things, which some crazy things do go on at communes, but some of the things that have been described have just been unreal. And the St. Louis hunter that shoots the goat and straps it on the front of his car and drives there to have it, tagged during deer season. That's a very common motif throughout the Ozarks of farmers telling stories on stupid city slickers. And I've actually come across stories about our SMS archaeological cruise. There were folk tales because I was on the expedition. I knew what we did. And, we dug up that guy's cornfield, and we littered the area with beer cans, and we had an orgy, and then we went home. And it's folk tales, a large part of the urbanite, of the rural versus the urbanite.
There's quite a lot of folklore in Ozark Virgin. Folklore associated with Ozark virgins.
With young ladies who are virgins. Here's folklore about a virgin and a husband. I can tell you a lot of them. One related to this courtroom. There were two young ladies. There was a young lady named Ruby, a bright red-haired gal. I think it was Joplin where this occurred. She come down from Kansas City and was getting along pretty well there. She took up with first this man, then another, and kind of took up with this one fellow supposed to have a lot of money, and she hauled him into court for breach of promise. And her lawyer, the man's lawyer, argued this is ridiculous. I mean, breach of promise, there's nothing written why he didn't promise her anything. And her lawyer argued that, and they were making her out a prostitute and everything else. And her lawyer argued she's a virgin and produced 2 doctors who testified she is a virgin. And then the man's attorneys pulled in a couple of doctors. They examined her and said, she's a virgin. Well, the guy telling the story said he ran into Ruby 2 or 3 years after that, and the jury, they're pretty down on men trifling with virgins, young ladies. And they awarded her most of the $25,000 she was asking for, but the tale said he ran into Ruby 2 or 3 years after that over in Kansas and asked her if she was still in the same operation, wondering how in the world she did that. She had a sister, identical twin. Almost identical. He asked her if she was still in the same business, and she said, well, I'm doing my part, but Ruby can't do hers anymore. The sister. Her part anymore.
I'll tell you one of the stories still are going. The one that's fastest one in the Ozarks I ever heard, and it was the fact, was that a local radio star, back when the Jubilee was going full blast, was found on the steps of St. John's Hospital with his manly items removed. And they received telegrams from all over the United States within about a week's time, and they had flyers sent out there, and one of the radio stations that hired the man anyway had to make an announcement that nobody was sick or injured or anything like that.
That got the church in that spread too.
I never saw anything go so
With
fast
the,
as that did.
with the speed of transportation, not necessarily communication, but transportation these days, a story can travel from that Union 76 truck stop out there by Stratford to all points in North America within 36 hours. That's truck stops. I used to drive a truck for Stafford Brothers and for Sure-Way, those cow trucks and hog trucks. And things really travel up and down the roads. Of course, in a lot of other ways too. But that's a fairly elaborate kind of jest that does travel very fast. I'd never heard that. Probably out of the country or something.
I guess. Thank you, Dr. Holliday. We appreciate it very much.
Yeah.
I think we have